Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Battlefield Breakdown. This week, I will talk about the air war and particularly about the role of fighter planes in the air war. As you might have all seen in the news, F-16s have arrived in Ukraine.
Jets are in our sky, and officially today you see them.
That's, of course, brilliant news, but I will dig a bit deeper. What role did fighter planes play in the war? What role will Ukrainian F-16s play in the future? What are the obstacles the Ukrainian Air Force will face running the type? What will be the biggest advantage of this fighter plane compared to its Soviet era predecessors? Yeah, let's get started. So, actually, the air war in the whole full-scale invasion of Russia against Ukraine is the most underrepresented part of the entire war. We hear a lot of stories about land warfare. There are a lot of journalists embedded, all with good contacts and access to the front lines. But the Ukrainian Air Force is a very secretive force. They have a very, very high level of operational security. They don't allow journalists to visit their air bases and how they operate. They don't talk about this, so we don't hear anything about it. That does not by no way mean that the air war was not important or decisive. Actually, it played a very crucial role in this war and had so far a very decisive impact on it. And this is why fighters are important. This is why fighters are something that Ukraine wants to acquire, while there's, of course, extensive lobbying by the Ukrainian government in the West to supply these fighter jets. They have a very good reason for that. So let's start with the beginning of the war. In the first hours of Russia's full-scale invasion, Russia unleashed barrages of over 100 strike missiles against Ukraine, trying to target particularly the Ukrainian Air Force. Its air bases on the ground, the control network that command fighters, and of course bases for air defense assets. It also used extensive electronic warfare means to suppress and diminish the effectiveness of Ukrainian radars and command and control systems. Actually, during the first week of the entire war, Russia has launched roughly 1,100 missiles, ballistic and cruise missiles against Ukraine. That's roughly the same number as Russia launches now per year. So you can imagine the intensity of Russia's first strikes. However, the Ukrainian Air Force was prepared. It was actually quite well prepared for what was to come. It had dispersed its operational aircraft to smaller air bases and improvised air bases. It had hidden them wherever it could. It used old aircraft that were out of operation as decoys, parked them in slots at their air bases that are usually occupied by operational aircraft to attract Russian strikes and give Russia the impression that the Ukrainian Air Force would be damaged. It had modernized and modified its command and control network, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of procedures compared to its Soviet legacy. That made the Russians misjudge the importance of the targets they struck and destroyed, and it made Ukrainians' command and control network much more resilient because they had a decentralized structure, which is very unusual for Air Force, but also they had a very high degree of redundancy in what they had and what they commanded, and that made it possible for Ukraine to quickly relocate its assets and to bring damaged assets back to operations. And actually, after a few days, Ukrainian ground-based air defense came back into operation, and then, of course, they started to inflict quite heavy casualties on the Russian Air Force. But during these first days of the invasion, that a lot of Ukrainian surface-to-air missiles had to be relocated or were damaged in the initial Russian strikes. The Ukrainian fighter force carried the big burden of defending Ukraine's airspace. And although it inflicted quite serious casualties on the Russian side, it also suffered quite a lot because it was outranged and outnumbered in this air war. But nevertheless, without the Ukrainian fighter force, the air war would have looked very different in the first days of the war. Russia, of course, the VKS, the Russian Air Force, assisted, if I may say so, Ukrainian success by being a bit sloppy. They had very poor coordination with the ground forces, with the ground-based air defense forces. In the first days of the invasion, they had a very sloppy battle damage assessment. So when Russian missiles struck a target, the Russians automatically wrote it off as being destroyed. In fact, they often just damaged Ukrainian facilities, and after some repair or relocation, they could be brought back to operational status. There was also poor planning involved from the side of the Russian VKS, and there was poor logistical preparations. Russia had, of course, hoped to win the war quickly and decisively and to get air superiority fairly quickly and then exploit it. But that was not to be. And after a couple of weeks, actually, Russian air operations declined or had to decline because of the lack of forward-based ammunition, especially high-precision standoff weapons that had to be removed from storage and brought to the frontline air bases, because it had not planned for a long war. Also, the decision of the Russian General Staff to send in ground forces at the early stages of the war caused significant problems for the Russians, because they were operating the same ground-based air defense assets with their ground forces that pushed into Ukraine as Ukraine had, particularly Buk M1s. That made it difficult for the Russian fighters trying to search and destroy Ukrainian radar stations and air defense assets, because they never were quite sure whether an air defense asset was a Ukrainian or Russian one. And there were a lot of friendly fire incidents on the Russian side that made Russians order their ground-based air defense systems to go quiet. As a response, of course, Ukraine used the quiet status of the Russian ground-based air defense to attack Russian columns and armor with strike planes, knowing that whenever there are no Russian fighters around, that they can actually do so. But nevertheless, the total losses of the VKS, the Russian aerospace force, in the first weeks of the war is estimated to be up to 200 aircraft, which is a significant number. Because of these high losses, Moscow could not afford to conduct a conventional air campaign against Ukraine, or to continue a conventional air campaign. It then stayed by and large out of Ukrainian airspace with its fixed-wing aircraft, and resorted to standoff strikes with cruise missiles, with ballistic missiles, with standoff ammunition. The exception to that rule were, of course, the city of Mariupol, for example, where, because it was besieged, there was no ground-based air defense present in the later stages of the siege, and then the Russian Air Force basically carpet bombed the city and wiped it out like it did in Aleppo. Of course, the Russian aerospace force could not do that with the rest of Ukraine, because Ukrainian ground-based air defense was up and running, and of course also because Ukrainian fighter patrols were in the air. So of course then, from late March 2022 to the present time, the security of Ukrainian airspace rested predominantly, of course, on ground-based air defense. But fighters also played a role there. If you look at Russian cruise missile attacks against Ukraine, and you see maps depicting their path when they go through Ukraine, you see that cruise missiles often meander across the country. They fly loops, they fly kind of strange maneuvers. And that is because these cruise missiles want to evade ground-based air defense systems. And you can actually do that if you imagine Ukraine as a three-dimensional theater. I will use this paper a bit to illustrate what I'm talking about. So, bad news, dear flat earthers, the earth is round. So we have a kind of a curvature that presents an obstacle to any radar. If you have a ground-based radar standing on a curved surface, the radar beam will go straight into the air, and that means that after some kilometers you have what we air defense guys call radar shadow, an area behind the horizon where you don't see. Now imagine there are tree lines, there are houses, there are hills, there are mountains that increase these radar shadows that place obstacles to the ground-based radar to actually identify targets. That's what Russian cruise missiles use, especially when they attack targets in the west of Ukraine, Lviv, or even Kiev. There are a lot of hills, especially in the west of Kiev, and you can make use of these hills to evade detection by ground-based radars. And that's why all the strange loops that Russian missiles fly. Now, if you imagine you're in a fighter up in the air, you can, of course, look down to the surface. You can look behind hill lines. You can look down on tree lines, on houses. All these obstacles do not quite impede your view on what's going on. So fighter patrols are used and were used in the space between the large cities to intercept drones, to intercept cruise missiles. This was always a main and important task of the Ukrainian fighter force, and it keeps them busy to this day. On the other hand, you should also not underestimate the Russians trying to hunt Ukrainian fighters, because precisely because of that, just as much as they hunt for ground-based air defense systems, they try to destroy Ukrainian fighters on the ground, on their air bases. And they employ various means to try to do that. Ukraine counters that by rotating their fighter force through various air bases. Then usually the decision-making loop, once the Russians know where the Ukrainian fighters are, till they have ordered a strike on that facility, Ukrainian fighters are already gone, or they base them at improvised airstrips. If you search the internet, you can find, for example, a picture of a Ukrainian Su-27 aircraft that has a highway sign stuck in its air intake. And that is, of course, not because they're flying so low. That's because these aircraft land on highways as improvised runways and refuel and rearm from there. And well, if you miss the approach, you might take one of the signs of the highway with you. And yeah, this is of course then hard to guess for the Russians where Ukrainian fighters are, where to strike them. As mentioned in previous episodes, Russian satellite reconnaissance has a lot of gaps in it, and the decision-making loops on the Russian side were, especially in the initial phases of the war, quite long. So that allowed for safely operating fighters, even though Russians were hunting them. The second task of the Ukrainian fighter force is to contest the VKS on the front lines or on exposed parts of the front. And that is the really tricky part, because this is a daunting task. But nevertheless, there are actually some successes. So as you know, the VKS employs a lot of fixed-wing operations, and are actually, unfortunately, increasing over the last year. And this year, against Ukrainian positions, they try to strike from the air as much as they can. And the Ukrainian Air Force, because fighters are mobile, because you can hardly detect a fighter, is of course using fighters to contest the airspace there, to occasionally send in fighter patrols very low that lock on the Russian bombers, then launch their missiles and immediately turn around. This happens quite frequently, actually more frequently than it is reported, and it's although Ukraine faces a lot of obstacles, there are actually quite successful stories on that as well. You might remember Snake Island, an island on the or very close to the mouth of the Danube that was occupied by Russia at the very beginning of the war and liberated by Ukraine in autumn of 2022. Snake Island was too far away for Russian ground-based air defense to cover it. The most long-range seaborne surface-to-air missiles the Russians had were the S-300 on the cruiser Moskva, which was sunk by Ukraine in April of that year. Hence, Russia had to protect its assets on Snake Islands by sending fighters, and Ukrainians contested these fighters, intercepted quite some of them, and together with drone strikes on ships resupplying Snake Islands, it exhausted the Russian presence there, and ultimately the Russians had to withdraw from Snake Island and give up the occupation. That in turn allowed Ukraine to resume maritime traffic from the Danube. It prevented the Russians from cutting off the mouth of the Danube to Ukrainian trade. And if you have watched all the grain saga, that was actually a quite significant victory for Ukraine, because it allowed Ukraine later on to resume grain export without Russian consensus. Fighters and fighter patrols contesting the use of airspace over Snake Island and over the Black Sea, connecting Snake Island with occupied Crimea, were an important part of the Ukrainian overall plan to liberate Snake Island. One should not underestimate that. The second thing is, you might also have heard of Ukraine's contestation of the Black Sea. Stay in the theater. Well, of course, airborne launches of cruise missiles, Scalp and Storm Shadow played a role in that. But even there, if you launch cruise missiles towards occupied Crimea, the Ukrainian Air Force not only is using its old Su-24s as a launch platform, you usually have other fighters that launch high-speed anti-radiation missiles, American-provided missiles that home on surface-to-air missile systems and destroy their radars to suppress, at least, or destroy Russian air defense assets that are in the way of these cruise missiles, just as much as Ukrainian Air Force fighters try to distract the VKS fighter patrols from the area by trying to contest them elsewhere. That increases, of course, the chance of a cruise missile attack on the Ukrainian side to get through Russian air defenses and destroy a target in Crimea. And yes, of course, other operations like electronic warfare operations, special operations to reconnoiter Russian air defense positions, sometimes even destroy them with partisans or with special forces, also play a role into that. These are very complex operations. It's not just Ukrainian getting cruise missiles and then bada boom, destroying whatever they want. These are complex, very well planned operations, synchronized between special forces, air force, and ground forces. But fighters also play a role in that. We should not underestimate the importance of the Ukrainian fighter force for the conduct of this war and for its overall outcome. So what are the obstacles Ukraine faces in the air war? Well, first of all is, unfortunately, of course, the Ukrainian Air Force has, over the course of the war, lost a significant number of fighter planes. Ukraine is a large country. To keep combat air patrols in the air in different areas, you need a lot of fighters. The minimum number that is usually given is 80 fighters to keep up the defensive counter-air tasks. If you include strike tasks and if you want to have a comfortable reserve to better plan air operations, Zelensky has used the number of 130 aircraft. That, of course, would be better, but 80 is the absolute minimum. We are, unfortunately, given all the losses, Ukraine has lost documented losses over 80 aircraft during the war, and there might be war below both numbers, unfortunately. The other problem is, of course, the logistical sustainability of Soviet fighters in Ukrainian hands is a bit questionable. First, factories maintaining engines and maintaining MiG-29s and Su-27s, they have been attacked by Russia throughout the war. The second, the ammunition producers, Artem especially, that produces the R-27 missile, the main air-to-air missile the Ukrainian Air Force uses, has been attacked at least 3 times during the war. If you remember the infamous attack on the Ukrainian child hospital on July 8th, in the background, when you see the Russian incoming cruise missiles, you also see that in the background there is a smoke column. Unfortunately, that smoke column is the Artem factory that produces R-27 missiles for the Ukrainian fighter force in Ukraine. That is a problem. If you operate fighters, that implies a lot of logistic and maintenance, and that implies, of course, the use of ammunition, air-to-air missiles in particularly. And this, for Soviet fighters, is a problem on top of losses. So, of course, Ukraine wants to operate a Western-type fighter. The spare parts can be provided by the West. You are not dependent on smuggling Russian subcomponents and parts into Ukraine. The second thing is that complex maintenance tasks could be conducted abroad, so you're not dependent on whether your own factories and installations survive a Russian missile attack or not. And most importantly, you can tap into Western supplies of air defense missiles and air-to-air missiles, and that is, of course, the biggest advantage of Western fighters, and F-16 in particular. So Ukraine now got a very low number of F-16s, 6 pieces. This is, of course, good, but it will, for the time being, not change the operational picture for the Ukrainian Air Force. But, of course, operating F-16s in Ukraine as such will give the first experiences in how to maintain and how to operate this model, which, especially in terms of logistics, maintenance, will be is very different than the Russian models. These experiences then will help Ukraine to scale the effort to maintain and to operate more F-16s that will come in the future. Where will F-16s be used? Well, predominantly and initially to cover the Ukrainian airspace against Russian cruise missiles and drone attacks. Unfortunately, most of the Soviet ground-based air defense systems are out of ammunition. Hence, Ukraine has huge gaps in its air defense perimeters. These gaps need to be covered by fighters, and this will be the most important task for these F-16s for the time being. At a later stage, of course, Ukrainian F-16s may be used to contest the VKS on the front lines. However, as for now, they will probably not be much more efficient than the Soviet legacy fighters Ukraine employs by now. Why is that? Well, we're talking about a Block 15 F-16, so very early production models from the 80s. They still have a manually or mechanically tilted radar, the APG-66. They have rather older electronic support measures and electronic countermeasure suits. So their radar has a limited range compared to the most modern Russian fighters, MiG-31s and Su-35s that are used by the Russians for combat air patrols. Apart from the fact that American AMRAAMs are active radar homing missiles versus most of the Ukrainian R-27s were semi-active homing radars, and that made it necessary for Ukrainian fighters to continuously illuminate the Russian fighter, versus the American missile is a fire and forget weapon. You lock on the enemy fighter, fire, and you can turn around. That is a particular advantage of the American missile. And the American radar has a track while scan modus. That means that Ukrainian F-16 can still monitor the airspace around it while it tracks enemy incoming fighters in an older version of the MiG-29 and the Su-27 as Ukraine operates them. If you switch from scanning to tracking mode, you lose the ability to scan the airspace in front of you. You then track a certain target or a certain amount of targets that you can track. That leads to the loss of situation awareness. And of course, because the radar beam on the target is longer, it usually tips off the Russian pilot that his plane is being tracked. These two advantages Ukrainian F-16s have. Greater advantages, of course, could be achieved if the US would deliver more modern versions of the F-16 to Ukraine. We also don't know which versions of the AMRAAM missile, beyond visual range air-to-air missile the F-16 uses, will be delivered by the US. There are different versions of that with different ranges, so it's very hard to guess whether or not Ukrainian fighters will square even with most of the Russian combat air patrols, or whether they will still have a severe disadvantage in terms of range. But on the long run, of course, Ukraine will contest the Russian aerospace forces on the front line. You see the preparation already going on in Ukraine. Ukraine is targeting particularly Russian air defense assets, especially long-range air defense assets, close to the front, not only because they are used for terror bombing missions, but also because Russian ground-based air defense systems can shoot deep into Ukrainian airspace. They are often directed by flying AWACS, the A-50 kind of AWACS counterpart in the Russian aerospace forces. Ukraine has ambushed one of them to push them away, and they're trying to push away the Russian ground-based air defense systems to a distance that, again, because once they're ground-based, if they don't have a flying AWACS around them, they have the same horizon problem. That will increase the usable airspace for Ukrainian F-16s, and that will increase the place they can use to ambush and to attack Russian aircraft throwing glide bombs at Ukrainian lines. But be patient. This will need Ukraine, first of all, to operate more F-16s. Second, degrading the Russian ground-based air defense systems is an endeavor that takes a lot of time and a lot of ATACMS missiles that are provided bit by bit. So this is something that needs to be done over the course of months, if not years, and then conditions are ripe to, in a broader way, challenge the VKS. Current generation of older Block 15 or A and B model F-16s have their drawbacks. Of course, you can mitigate the drawbacks by delivering force enablers to Ukraine. Sweden already announced that it will at some time deliver a Saab 340 AAV and C aircraft. That's basically the Swedish counterpart to an AWACS. It's an airborne early warning station that can also control fighter operations. Being airborne, it has a much greater horizon to scan than any ground-based radar, and it can live direct fighters. Hence, for example, Ukrainian fighters do not have to switch on their own radar to the very last moment. This increases their stealth, and it increases the chance of ambushing Russian assets. Delivering assets like these is, of course, something the West can improve and do. Another asset that I would throw in is a passive radar or a passive detection system, like, for example, the Czech Vera system that was delivered to Moldova. This system basically tracks the radar emission of other fighters and can pinpoint their position very accurately. And if you wire then the position and movements of Russian aircraft from this passive sensor to Ukrainian F-16s, they can also fly without using their own active radar till the very last moment when they have to direct their missiles. It is completely stealth, so unlike another active radar, Russian fighter patrols would not have any idea that they're operating and that they're actually being tracked, and that increases the chance for Ukraine to ambush Russian aircraft and to shoot them down. And the more aircraft shot down, Russia has a very limited amount of aircraft coming into the frontline service each year. These are usually 1 to 2 dozen per year. As said at the beginning, Russia can't afford to really lose a lot of them, and this is why you don't need to eat through the entire Russian aerospace force to achieve more freedom of maneuver close to the front. You just need to contest the airspace to the Russians to the point that they can't operate freely. That is what is needed, not complete air superiority or air dominance in the Western sense. You basically need to push the Russian Air Force away so that they cannot back up their ground operations as they did or as they're still doing right now. And once Ukrainians have achieved that, they have more freedom to operate with their ground forces, to conduct strikes, to conduct drone operations, etc. So that's basically what Ukrainians are aiming for. F-16s alone will not make Ukraine to fight like NATO as such, because there will always be fewer numbers. There will be constraints on the use of ammunition and a lot of other combat enablers that NATO uses frequently to conduct very large-scale air operations simply aren't present in Ukraine, and there is no chance for Ukraine to get them in a reasonable time span. So we really need to distinguish what, in theory, NATO does, or what NATO does with the aircraft, and what Ukraine can do with the same platform. So yes, delivering F-16 was an important step. It's an important milestone, but it is one milestone in a very long road for Ukraine to deny the airspace over the front line or close to the front line, or at least to contest it in a very effective way, to be able to regain the initiative. Be patient and keep supporting Ukraine. this is a long war, and we will see how Ukrainian F-16s will do in the war. On this happy note, goodbye, and Slava Ukraini.